Hello, everyone. You may have heard me before on Donald Trump, but I'd like to give you another take, more rooted in economics, why I'm optimistic about the future of Mexico. So I'm an economist. I travel around to many different countries, and very often I'm asked if I'm trying to understand a country or an economy, is there some number I look at that other people are not looking at? And there is. The purpose of this talk is to teach you that number, why it matters, and this will help us understand at least three things. One, why has income inequality gone up? Two, why is this wonderful event here in Puebla rather than Chilpancingo or Nayarit? And three, why I'm relatively optimistic about Mexico. So let me tell you what that number is. It sounds a little complicated, but it's actually a simple idea. You look at a country and you ask, what is the maximum percent of the workforce in that country that has worked in manufacturing? Not how much right now, but in all of the history of that country, what percent of the labor force has worked in manufacturing? There's a striking regularity that is not often noticed. If you look at the world's wealthiest countries, putting aside oil, if you look at Germany, United Kingdom, United States, you always find that 30% or more of the workforce in the past has worked in manufacturing. And that, in essence, is how those countries built up their middle classes. They built up their middle classes, they had more wealth, they invested more in education, they had a less crazy politics, other good things happened, and they kept that lead. Every single one of those countries. Here's the underlying regularity. It is easier for productivity, for business success, to increase in manufacturing than in services or in agriculture. Let's take Mexico. We see this point very starkly. Mexico is on the verge of being, in the entire world, the number 3 exporter of automobiles. You're about to pass South Korea. You may have passed them already, I'm not sure, but you're about to be number 3. And that is a great achievement. That is manufacturing, making something in a factory. Now, if you look at a service, you look at education. Would anyone say that Mexico is number 3 in the world at education? No one would think of saying that. So in Mexico, in particular, there is a big split between the performance in manufacturing and the performance in services. If you look at the countries that are less wealthy, I'll come back to Mexico, but let's consider a few other countries. Let's take Brazil. What's the highest percentage of the Brazilian workforce that ever worked in manufacturing? It is 15%. And it has been going down since the late 1980s. Now it's about 13%. So Brazil is not building enough of a middle class. They have too many people working in their government, working in less productive services, working in retail. Manufacturing is the area where productivity increases are the easiest to pull off. Take India, a much poorer country than Brazil. In India, about 11% of the workforce is in manufacturing, and that number has been declining for decades. So most emerging economies today, if you ask, how is employment in manufacturing? In most cases, the number is declining. It has already peaked. It has peaked at 15% or lower. So these countries, they're producing a lot. India is producing a lot. It has a good growth rate. It's growing at about 6%. A lot of countries might envy a 6% growth rate. But with few manufacturing jobs, is India becoming a middle-class nation? Basically, it is not. Those returns, a lot of it, it's going to capital. Or look within Mexico. If you ask where within Mexico do we find wonderful auditoriums such as this, large crowds interested in ideas in the way that all of you are, interested in politics, interested in learning about feminism, introverts versus extroverts. Puebla, of course, is a center of Mexican manufacturing, and it has a large enough middle and upper class to afford this kind of venue. And if you look in Mexico, you see a lot of economic strength in the north, and of course, also in Puebla. I've been to Mexico many, many times. It was mentioned before, I believe this is my 35th trip to Mexico. If people have never been to Mexico before, they ask me, where should I go? Do you know what I tell them? I say, go to Puebla. It's maybe the single nicest part of Mexico, and that is in large part because it has a lot of manufacturing wealth. So there's something deeply unfair about the world today. You have the countries that are already wealthy, and they were growing at a time when manufacturing created a lot of jobs. Today, manufacturing creates less jobs. That is because of automation. In the old days, a factory was a noisy place. A port was a busy place, full of people running around, bumping into each other. Today, if you visit the world's largest ports, go to Long Beach, California, go to the Netherlands, go to Singapore, the port is a quiet place. You don't see many people. The factory, for the most part, is a much quieter place. So we're all producing more, we're building more factories, that's great. But I said this would help us explain income inequality. If your nation has a problem with income inequality, ask the basic question, are enough people working in manufacturing seeing productivity gains? Now, I said I would come back to Mexico, and I said most emerging economies, they are losing jobs in manufacturing. And this is contributing to their income inequality. So you might wonder, well, are there any exceptions? And there are two basic exceptions in the world, two emerging economies which still have fairly robust employment in manufacturing. Those two countries are first China, and the second, right here, Mexico. So current Mexican employment in manufacturing, it's at about 23%. Now that's not close to the peaks of, say, 40% that South Korea once had, but it's well above Brazil, a large amount above India, even more above that of South Africa, which also has been industrializing. So the emerging economies that actually have the potential for building relatively large middle classes, when you look at this number, those two economies, in my opinion, my humble opinion as an economist who has been wrong about many things, but still, I am most optimistic about China and Mexico. Now, why are China and Mexico exceptions? They're not really two countries that are very similar, but they have, I think, one important feature, and that is what we call scale, or economies of scale, or size. China is 1.3 billion people, a vast territory, and one of the two largest GDPs in the world. It's easy to see the size of China. Mexico is not nearly as large. It's even smaller than Brazil. But Mexico gets size another way, and that is it has managed to build a good working partnership with the United States and Canada. And Mexico, in manufacturing, it acts as if it has size. It has, in essence, the size of North America behind it, and thus keeps larger manufacturing employment. Now, sometimes people ask, well, why can't Mexico grow as fast as China? China grew a lot of years at 10%, then it was down to 8%, then down to 7%. Right now, we're not sure what it is, but it's probably a larger number than Mexico. For a while, Mexico has been in the range 2 to 2.5%, and that looks pretty stable, but India, 6%, China, 6-7%. What's going on here? And here's the way I think about why Mexico now is growing at 2.5%. The manufacturing sector, the export sector, large parts of the formal sector, they are already doing very well in Mexico. if you look at data on exports, competitive in the entire world economy. Mexico grows as slowly as it does, in my view, as an outsider, because it is hard to get more labor from the informal sector, small shops, retail, peddlers, people maybe Spanish is not their first language. They're doing jobs, small businesses, they're entrepreneurs, it's great, they work hard, but they don't pay taxes, they're outside the law, they do not move into the formal manufacturing sector. And that too, 2.5% growth rate, that's the rate at which labor in Mexico essentially is moving from the less productive informal sector to the more productive formal sector. And that just does not happen at the rate of 8 or 10% a year. You cannot get 10% growth moving labor through those bottlenecks. And that is how I think of the Mexican economy. A big part of it is doing very well. The key problem limiting growth is getting more laborers to be partaking in the successful parts of the Mexican economy. Now, just to tie this all up into my big optimistic picture, this is what I find when I study growth. One of the nicest countries in the world, Denmark. It's wealthy, a great social welfare state, it's peaceful, they more or less get along with each other. You've never heard talk of the Danish economic miracle, and they never grew 10%. They hardly ever even grew 5%. What Denmark has done is year in, year out, they come pretty close to 1.9% growth. And for 100 years, they didn't really screw that up, the World War aside. That is how Denmark became Denmark. 1.9% growth on average almost every year. It's not an exciting formula. You don't make dramatic movies about Denmark. But when I look at that number I started with, what percent of the workforce is in manufacturing? It's pretty high in Mexico. There's some rate at which labor passes in Mexico from the informal sector to the formal sector. That's about 2% or a bit more. My view, my strange counterintuitive view, is that Mexico actually is the new Denmark. That this is a stable growth path. You will manage 2 to 3% growth each year, most years. And if you compound 2% growth every year and keep at that, that is how Denmark became Mexico. And my guess is that 30 years from now, we will look at Mexico as more of an economic success than China. China has the 7%, the 8%, but they've also had years of negative 10%, of millions of people dying or being killed in a way that's hard for us to imagine. So, just to tie all the pieces together, Puebla, wonderful place, manufacturing, employment. Mexico has been relatively successful at this. It's why I'm more optimistic about Mexico than Brazil. It will never feel that great to grow at a slow pace, but it seems that stable, slower growth is indeed possible. And I think based on this, there is a way forward for much of the world, and also especially the economy of Mexico. Thank you all for listening.